I still recall the precise moment I understood that my mother-in-law had never genuinely accepted me. I was in the kitchen, my hands still wet from doing the dishes, when she nonchalantly informed my husband, Daniel, "I have booked the tickets for the Maldives. The resort is magnificent, featuring private villas, ocean views, everything one could dream of." Her voice carried that high-pitched enthusiasm she always used when seeking admiration from others, and I felt a slight swell of excitement at the thought of escaping to paradise with my family. However, then came the pause, that intentional silence preceding the sting. She gazed directly at me, her lips forming that polite yet lethal smile, and added, "Of course, it's just for family. We wouldn't want outsiders to disrupt the atmosphere." The term outsiders echoed in my mind like a slap. I opened my mouth, prepared to protest, but Daniel, my husband, the man who had vowed to be with me forever, merely shifted uncomfortably and muttered, "Mom," without completing his thought. She interrupted him, waving her hand dismissively as if swatting away a fly. "Darling, you'll be grateful. She doesn't even enjoy the ocean, does she? Moreover, she will be far more comfortable at home." I yearned to shout that I adored the ocean, that I had fantasized about the Maldives since I was a teenager perusing travel magazines, but the words became lodged in my throat. Instead, I managed a forced, brittle smile and replied, "You're right, I'll be fine here." Yet, inside, I was falling apart. That evening, when Daniel and I were alone, I attempted to revisit the topic. "You didn't say anything," I murmured, hugging my knees at the edge of the bed. He wearily rubbed his face. "You know how she is. Confronting her will only exacerbate the situation. Let's just allow her this." Allow her this? My own husband was instructing me to step aside, to remain at home like an unwelcome guest in my own marriage, while his mother reveled in the splendor of turquoise waters and golden sands. I remained awake long after he had fallen asleep, gazing at the ceiling and vowing to myself that I would not allow this to defeat me. However, as the date of their departure approached, I felt like a mere shadow within my own home. She strutted around with shopping bags filled with swimsuits, hats, and flowing dresses, deliberately leaving receipts on the counter for me to see how extravagantly she was preparing for a trip from which I was excluded. My heart ached each time Daniel averted his gaze, feigning ignorance to the humiliation I faced daily. On the morning of their departure, I stood at the entrance as she offered me a condescendingly sympathetic hug. "Take care of yourself, dear. Don't overwork yourself. Perhaps we'll bring you back a seashell as a memento." Her laughter resonated in the air like shattered glass, and Daniel pecked my cheek absent-mindedly, already hurrying after his mother. I observed them drive away, my stomach feeling empty, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I might completely break down. Instead, I shut the door, approached my phone, and made a call I hadn't intended but had been secretly rehearsing in my mind throughout the week. The voice on the other end answered immediately. "Are you prepared?" it inquired, calm and steady, the type of voice that reminded me I still had options. "Yes," I replied, surprising myself with the firmness in my tone. "Proceed." Within hours, I found myself on a flight of my own, not to the Maldives, but to a destination even more surprising. You see, my best friend Clara was a travel journalist, and she had connections with resorts worldwide. When I had shared with her how my mother-in-law had excluded me, she had merely smirked and said, "Let her believe she's in charge. You and I will craft our own narrative." So now, while my in-laws were enjoying cocktails in the Maldives, I was disembarking from a plane in Bali, where Clara had organized a feature article about hidden luxury retreats. The resort that greeted us was not only luxurious, it was stunning, the kind of place that made even the Maldives seem commonplace. Endless infinity pools seamlessly blended into emerald cliffs, while private butlers welcomed us with flowers, and the air was infused with the scents of frangipani and sea salt. For the first time in weeks, I felt truly alive again. Clara nudged me with a smile. "You deserve this. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I returned her smile, although deep down, I still felt the sting of rejection. However, Fate has a peculiar way of intertwining unexpected threads, and it wasn't long before those threads wove into something even my mother-in-law could not have envisioned. A few days into our trip, Clara proposed that we visit a sister property owned by the resort, a destination popular among high-profile families and celebrities. As we wandered through the lobby, sipping our welcome drinks, I was nearly speechless. Standing across the marble hall, dressed in a flowing beach dress and oversized sunglasses, was none other than my mother-in-law. She hadn't gone to the Maldives after all. She had deceived us. My heart raced, and my first instinct was to hide, but Clara grasped my arm. "No," she whispered emphatically. "This is your moment. Embrace it." My legs quaked as I approached her. She was laughing with a group of affluent women, boasting about her son and how he had treated her to this exclusive getaway. When she finally spotted me, the color drained from her face. "You," she gasped, as if I were a specter. I smiled sweetly. "Hello, Margaret. What a surprise to see you here." The other women exchanged glances, sensing the tension between us. My mother-in-law stuttered, "What are you doing here?" I tilted my head slightly. "Oh, I was invited. Clara is writing an article, and I'm assisting her. This place is stunning, isn't it?" The women shared furtive looks, whispering about how I must have significant connections to be present. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, and I could see the storm brewing in her eyes. Later, when we found ourselves alone by the pool, she confronted me. "You weren't meant to be here. You were supposed to stay home." I met her glare with unwavering eyes. "Not anymore." She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could do so, one of the resort managers came over and greeted me warmly, expressing gratitude to Clara and me for agreeing to feature the property in her magazine. Margaret's jaw dropped. For once, she was not the center of attention, I was. The expression on her face, a blend of disbelief and speechlessness, was more gratifying than any revenge I could have orchestrated. However, satisfaction is a transient feeling, and as the days progressed, the true narrative was not about eclipsing Margaret. It was about uncovering my own strength, coming to the realization that I did not require her approval or even Daniel's indifference to determine my value. Nevertheless, I could not overlook the delightful irony of witnessing her falter each time someone treated me with the respect she had endeavored to deny me. Throughout that afternoon, I strolled through the resort with a confidence I had not experienced in months, almost as if the very place was infusing life into me, and every time Margaret caught a glimpse of me, I noticed her jaw tighten a bit more, her meticulously crafted social facade beginning to crack at the edges, until ultimately, by the time dinner was served, she appeared as though she was holding her breath beneath the surface. I took a seat at a long wooden table by the ocean, the sunset casting everything in hues of gold and pink, with Clara beside me, her laughter overflowing as she recounted travel tales to the other guests, and I noticed Margaret observing from 2 tables away, her expression frozen in disbelief when the resort's manager approached to inquire about my enjoyment of the stay, offering to arrange a private excursion for Clara and me the following day. "You're being treated like royalty," Clara whispered teasingly, and I smiled, although my insides were buzzing with a blend of triumph and anxiety, for this was not merely about luxury, it was about reclaiming a part of myself that Margaret had attempted to take away. Later that night, as I stood on my balcony overlooking the waves, my phone vibrated. It was Daniel. "Hey," his voice was. "Mom says you're fine back home." My heart raced. I nearly chuckled at the irony. "Actually," I replied slowly, "I'm not home. I'm in Bali." Silence followed. "Then, Bali? What do you mean?" I leaned against the railing, the sea breeze lifting my hair. "I mean your mother lied. She said you were all going to the Maldives, but here she is, parading around the same resort I'm staying at." Daniel exhaled sharply, the sound of someone realizing their world wasn't as tidy as they believed. I didn't know. She told me she had different plans for me, and I thought," his words trailed off. "You thought what, Daniel?" That it was acceptable to let her control everything? That it was simpler to just go along? My voice trembled, but it was with anger, not weakness. Do you understand how humiliating it felt to be excluded from a vacation with my own husband? To watch you remain silent? He sighed, heavy and weary. I didn't want to confront her. You know how she reacts. I swallowed hard, the pain bubbling in my chest. And what about me, Daniel? Do you care how I feel when you don't stand up for me? The silence stretched until it broke, and he muttered, I'll come tomorrow. I'll book a flight. But I hesitated to respond, as part of me was uncertain if I even wanted him there anymore. That night, sleep came in fits, and I dreamed of drowning in waves of laughter that echoed Margaret's voice. The following morning, Clara pulled me to a yoga pavilion overlooking the cliffs, determined to help me clear my mind. You can't allow her to take up so much space in your thoughts, she said, stretching into a pose with enviable grace. This is your life, your story. She's merely a minor character who believes she's the lead. I smiled faintly, but my stomach twisted when I saw Margaret on the other side of the pavilion, feigning ignorance as she joined her affluent friends. Clara noticed my glance and muttered, Of course she's here. Let's give her a performance, shall we? We laughed more loudly than necessary, we moved effortlessly, and when the instructor complimented my form in front of the entire class, Margaret's frown deepened. After class, she finally confronted me, cornering me near the juice bar. Why are you doing this? She hissed. I blinked innocently. Doing what? Her eyes narrowed. You're trying to embarrass me. I tilted my head, my voice steady. Margaret, you've spent months attempting to belittle me. If you feel embarrassed now, that's not my responsibility. That's simply the truth catching up with you. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unable to articulate her thoughts, and for the first time, I noticed fear flicker in her eyes, not fear of me, but fear of losing control. Later that day, Daniel arrived, looking disheveled from travel and guilt. He found me by the pool, his eyes darting nervously between me and his mother. We need to talk, he said, pulling me aside. Yes, I replied coolly. We do. He rubbed the back of his neck. I didn't know she lied. She told me you didn't want to come, that you'd be uncomfortable. I should have questioned it. I'm sorry. His apology seemed sincere, but the ache within me was not so easily alleviated. Do you comprehend what this did to me, Daniel? It wasn't merely a vacation. It was about respect. Your mother has treated me like an outsider from the very beginning, and you've allowed it. His shoulders slumped. I was trying to maintain the peace. I shook my head, my voice trembling. Peace without respect isn't peace. It's surrender. He looked at me then, truly looked, and I saw the shame in his eyes. I don't want to lose you, he whispered. My throat tightened, but before I could reply, Margaret appeared, her voice cutting. Daniel, don't let her manipulate you. She's turning this into drama. He turned to her, and for the first time in our marriage, he didn't recoil. No, Mom. You manipulated me. You lied. You tried to control everything, and I allowed it, but not anymore. My heart was filled with a feeling I hadn't experienced in ages, hope. That evening, the resort put on a cultural performance by the sea, and I found myself sitting next to Daniel, with Clara on my other side, as we watched the dancers move elegantly beneath the starlit sky. Margaret was seated a few rows back, feeling isolated, as her friends whispered among themselves after catching enough of the family tension to distance themselves. For once, she wasn't the center of attention. I should have felt triumphant, but instead, an unexpected sadness washed over me. Perhaps it was the realization that no matter what happened, she would always be Daniel's mother, and this conflict wasn't solely between us, it was affecting the man I loved. After the performance, as the guests began to leave, I approached her. She regarded me with caution, anticipating yet another confrontation. Instead, I spoke gently, saying, I don't wish to fight you, Margaret. I simply want to be part of the family without having to plead for it." Her eyes softened for a brief moment before she concealed it again. "You think it's that easy," she replied quietly. I shrugged. "Maybe it is. Maybe you're just scared that if I become part of this family, you'll lose your grip. But I don't seek control. I only want respect." She turned her gaze away, her hands nervously twisting the strap of her purse. "Respect must be earned." I nodded in agreement. "And so does love." I walked away before she could reply, leaving her to ponder my words. That night, Daniel and I spent hours talking on the balcony, with the sound of waves crashing below us. He assured me he would establish boundaries, finally prioritizing us instead of living under his mother's expectations. And for the first time, I believed him, having witnessed him stand up to her myself. As the days went by, the tension remained, but something had changed. Margaret no longer wielded the same influence over us. She still shot glares and attempted to make snide comments, but they now fell flat, like arrows lost in the wind. One morning, I noticed her watching me as I shared laughter with Clara and Daniel over breakfast, and for a fleeting moment, her expression was not one of disdain. And it dawned on me then that underneath all her harshness lay fear, the fear of being abandoned as her son created a life without her at the core. This realization didn't justify her actions, but it did clarify them, and it empowered me to release some of my resentment. By the end of our trip, as we were getting ready to leave, she caught me off guard by quietly approaching while we packed. "You managed yourself well," she said with reluctance, her gaze not quite meeting mine. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest she could come to one. I offered a faint smile. "Thank you." As we boarded our flights back home, I understood that things wouldn't magically change overnight. However, the dynamics had shifted. I was no longer the outsider. I had discovered my voice, and Margaret had finally recognized that I wasn't someone to be overlooked. More importantly, Daniel had noticed it too. In that moment, with the engines roaring beneath me and the future laid out ahead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time, like I was truly where I belonged. Upon returning home, I brought back not just memories of Bali but also a quiet strength that Margaret could no longer undermine. Although I prepared myself for the transition back to everyday life, I felt different, more grounded, as if a new version of myself had been forged in that crucible of humiliation and resilience. Still, the tension lingered, for Margaret was not a woman who easily yielded, and I learned that quickly when she appeared unannounced at our doorstep 2 weeks later, her heels clicking on the driveway like alarm bells, her eyes scanning me with that same critical sparkle, though this time I stood my ground. Daniel opened the door, his face a careful mask of politeness, and she glided inside, bringing a tin of her renowned lemon cookies as if that could erase the bitterness of the past months. "I thought we could have a conversation," she declared, taking a seat in the living room without waiting for an invitation. And I found myself sitting across from her, my heart racing yet steady, resolved not to revert to the timid woman she once dominated. She cleared her throat, her fingers drumming on the cookie tin. "I know things got intense in Bali. But family should stick together, wouldn't you agree?" I raised an eyebrow. "Family should respect one another," I responded calmly, and Daniel nodded in agreement beside me, his presence feeling like a shield this time rather than a shadow. Margaret pressed her lips together, clearly unaccustomed to being outnumbered. "I'm concerned about Daniel," she said, directing her attention to him as if I weren't present. "He's always been so loyal, and I don't want to see him misled." A surge of heat rose in my chest, but before I could respond, Daniel stated firmly, "Mom, I'm not misled. I'm married. And I need you to realize that my wife is not a threat to you. She's my partner. If you can't accept that, then you'll be the one pushing me away." Her eyes widened at his declaration, and I observed 1,000 unspoken objections dance on her tongue before she swallowed them, her pride battling with her fear of losing him. The silence lingered until she finally murmured, "I never wanted to lose you, Daniel." My throat constricted, for in that moment, I perceived not just the overbearing matriarch but also a mother frightened of being forgotten, and though part of me still simmered with anger, another part softened. "You won't lose him," I said softly, surprising even myself. "But you will lose us both if you continue trying to exclude me." She looked at me then, truly looked, as if for the first time she recognized me not as an intruder but as a woman who loved her son fiercely, and something flickered in her eyes, a blend of resistance and reluctant respect. From that day onward, our relationship didn't change into sunshine and roses overnight, but small shifts began to occur. She still made her sharp remarks occasionally, but Daniel would shut them down before they could cut too deep, and sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she would soften. I noticed her watching me with an unreadable expression, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle that had always eluded her. Months went by, and one brisk autumn morning, I found out I was pregnant. My hands shook as I held the test, a mix of joy and fear colliding in my chest. When I shared the news with Daniel, he swept me off my feet, laughing and crying simultaneously. "We're going to be parents," he murmured into my hair, and for the first time since our wedding, I felt completely, unmistakably chosen. Yet, alongside the joy, a familiar knot of anxiety formed. Margaret. How would she respond? Would she attempt to control this too? My questions were answered during a family dinner when Daniel and I finally revealed the news. She froze for a long moment, her fork suspended in midair, and then, to my astonishment, her eyes brimmed with tears. "A grandchild," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I never thought," she paused, gathering herself, and then looked at me with an expression so genuine it took me by surprise. "Congratulations," she said softly, and for once, there was no malice, no hidden jab. As the months passed, something changed. She began arriving with small gifts for the baby, inquiring about how I was feeling, and although her advice sometimes came wrapped in criticism, I could sense her genuine effort to bridge the divide. There were days I wanted to slam the door in her face, to remind her of all the ways she'd hurt me, but then the baby kicked, and I thought of the family we were creating, and I chose patience, not for her, but for myself. The night I went into labor, chaos erupted. Daniel panicked, running in circles while I breathed through contractions, and it was Margaret, surprisingly composed, who took charge, leading us to the hospital with a calm authority I hadn't anticipated. Hours later, as I held our newborn daughter against my chest, I noticed Margaret standing quietly in the corner, tears silently streaming down her cheeks, and for the first time, I didn't view her as an adversary. I perceived her as a grandmother, both humbled and human. When she finally came closer, her hands shaking, she inquired, "May I?" I nodded, and she cradled the baby with such gentleness that it made my throat tighten. "She's perfect," she murmured, her voice heavy with emotion. In that instant, something began to heal, not entirely, not permanently, but sufficiently. Sufficient to foster the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, we could progress. In the ensuing months, our lives became filled with sleepless nights, countless diapers, and a love that made even the toughest days manageable. Margaret came to visit frequently, sometimes overstepping boundaries, sometimes astonishing me with her genuine kindness. Although I remained cautious, I started to view her not just through the lens of our conflicts but also through my daughter's eyes, who beamed whenever her grandmother walked into the room. And perhaps that was the lesson in all of this, that family isn't about perfection or control, but about learning, stumbling, and trying again. Reflecting on it now, I understand that if Margaret hadn't left me out of that vacation, I might never have unearthed the strength I possess today, nor would Daniel and I have confronted the truths that ultimately fortified our marriage. What awaited her at that resort wasn't merely my unanticipated presence, it was the start of her loosening her hold on control and discovering, instead, a route toward acceptance. And what awaited me was something even more profound, the realization that my worth was never hers to determine, that I had always belonged, and that sometimes the most painful exclusions lead to the most transformative awakenings. Motherhood transformed me in ways I hadn't foreseen. It stripped me bare, revealing every vulnerability, yet it also grounded me with a strength I hadn't realized I had. As the weeks melted into months filled with late-night feedings and tranquil dawns with my daughter nestled against my chest, I began to perceive the world differently, not just through my own perspective, but through her eyes, small and unaware, taking in everything around her as if life itself were a tale being narrated to her. During those moments of contemplation, I frequently thought of Margaret, pondering how much of her harshness stemmed from fear and how much was merely a matter of habit. Regardless of the ratio, she remained a part of our lives, whether I appreciated it or not, and gradually, albeit reluctantly, I started to release some of my resentment, not for her benefit but for my daughter's, as I didn't want her to grow up in a war zone of grudges. Daniel also surprised me, stepping up in ways I had previously doubted he was capable of. He established clear boundaries with his mother, consistently prioritizing us, and although the journey wasn't without its bumps, there were flare-ups, tense dinners, moments when Margaret reverted to old behaviors. It felt different now because Daniel didn't back down. He stood by my side, and that unity was like a soothing balm over wounds that had once seemed impossible to heal. One chilly winter evening, almost a year after the Bali confrontation, Margaret invited us for dinner. I was hesitant at first, cautious about re-entering her territory, but Daniel squeezed my hand and said, "Let's see if she truly means it this time." Upon our arrival, the house was filled with the aroma of roasted herbs and cinnamon, and to my surprise, Margaret welcomed me with genuine warmth, not the forced smile of politeness but something much softer. Dinner started off awkwardly. Old habits are hard to break, but as the night progressed, she inquired about my work, about Clara, and even complimented the dress I was wearing. I kept anticipating a hidden insult, a subtle dig, but it never materialized. After dessert, when Daniel took our daughter upstairs to show her an old toy, Margaret and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen, the silence heavy between us. She poured herself a cup of tea and finally said, "You know, I wasn't fair to you." My heart skipped at her words. I searched her expression, half expecting sarcasm, but found only exhaustion. I believed that if I pushed hard enough, Daniel would remain the boy I raised. I didn't want to witness his transformation. Her voice trembled, and for the first time, I caught a glimpse of the vulnerability hidden beneath her strong facade. "But he's not a boy anymore. And that's not your fault, it's my fault for not letting go." I swallowed hard, emotions swirling within me, because although I had yearned for an apology, I hadn't genuinely thought I'd ever receive one. "I never intended to take him away from you," I murmured. "I just wanted to be by his side." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "I understand that now." It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it was a crack in the wall, and for me, that was sufficient. Months went by, and life settled into a routine, Daniel and I juggling work, parenthood, and the delicate truce with Margaret, who occasionally surprised us with small acts of genuine kindness. She babysat without criticism, brought meals without comment, and sometimes, when I caught her humming to the baby, I glimpsed the woman she could have been if fear hadn't warped her love into control. Yet, challenges persisted. There were times when her old habits resurfaced, when she questioned our decisions or made subtle jabs, and in those instances, I had to remind myself that growth is never a straight line, that forgiveness is not a one-time gift but a daily choice. Still, the conflicts were smaller now, easier to confront, because I no longer felt powerless. One spring, Clara came to visit, eager to see how things had evolved. Over coffee in my kitchen, she smirked. "You've come a long way since that day you called me in tears. Who would have thought Bali would change everything?" I chuckled softly, shaking my head. It wasn't Bali. It was me finally realizing I didn't need her permission to exist. Clara raised her mug in a playful toast to existing loudly. We clinked our cups, and I felt a wave of gratitude for her, for the journey that had brought me here, even for the struggles that had molded me. The real challenge arose later that summer when Daniel proposed a family vacation for all of us, including Margaret. My initial reaction was one of panic. The idea of being confined with her brought back old anxieties, but then I glanced at my daughter, now toddling and filling the room with her laughter, and I understood that I wanted her to have memories of family unity, not divisions. So, I cautiously agreed, and we arranged a week at a lakeside cabin. To my astonishment, the trip turned out to be quite peaceful. Margaret assisted with cooking, shared stories from Daniel's childhood, and although there were a few tense moments, like when she insisted the baby should sleep with extra blankets despite the summer warmth, Daniel calmly guided her, and I didn't need to raise my voice. One evening, as we gathered by the fire, she turned to me and softly said, "You're a good mother." Those simple words struck a chord in my heart, like a key turning in a long-locked door. I smiled, holding back tears. "Thank you." In that instant, I realized something significant. The woman who had once tried to erase me from her son's life was now, slowly and reluctantly, making space for me in her own. The journey wasn't flawless, and I was aware that more challenges lay ahead, but I also recognized that I had transformed, that I could endure whatever came my way, because I had learned to define myself not by her acceptance or rejection but by the love I both gave and received. Years later, when my daughter was old enough to inquire about family stories, I would share not only the beautiful ones but also the difficult ones, for within them lay the truth that family isn't about never hurting one another. It's about how you respond after the hurt, whether you choose to build bridges or burn them. And as I sat there by the fire, with Margaret softly humming as she rocked my daughter to sleep, I realized that although the scars of our past would never disappear, they had imparted something invaluable to us all, that love, messy and imperfect, was still worth fighting for. As the years went by, life took us along its familiar paths, Daniel steadily progressing in his career, me finding joy in both motherhood and my own work, our daughter evolving from a curious toddler into a lively little girl who asked 1,000 questions daily. But throughout it all was Margaret, a presence that once felt like a storm cloud and now, while not always bright, had transformed into something more intricate, something I could coexist with. There were still times when the old Margaret emerged, like the day she insisted my daughter needed ballet lessons because every proper young girl learns discipline through dance. But this time, rather than feeling trapped, I simply smiled and replied, "Thank you for the suggestion, Margaret, but we'll decide together what's best." And Daniel supported me, his calm voice affirming that our partnership was solid, and although Margaret huffed, she let it go. Each time that occurred, each time she retreated without the conflict escalating, I sensed the equilibrium of our family settling further into place. Yet, there were reminders of the past, faint echoes of that old wound. One rainy afternoon, while folding laundry, I found myself reminiscing about that day in the kitchen when Margaret had first told me I wasn't welcome on the Maldives trip, and the sting of exclusion returned for just a moment, sharp as glass. But then I heard my daughter's laughter in the next room, Daniel's voice reading her a story, and I realized that the pain, though unforgettable, no longer defined me. It had been the fire that shaped me, but it was not the fire I lived in anymore. I bore the scar, yes, but I also carried strength, and that was the distinction. One summer, Clara visited again, her travels having taken her halfway around the globe and back, and as we sat on the porch with lemonade, watching our kids play together, she leaned over and whispered, "So, what's the latest with your dragon-in-law?" I chuckled softly. "She's evolving. Slowly. Think of it as a dragon learning how to purr." Clara snorted. "Well, don't let her breathe fire again. You've worked too hard to build this peace." I nodded, knowing she was right, because though Margaret and I had reached a fragile truce, it was a truce that required maintenance, patience, and boundaries. A real test came the year we decided to take another big vacation, this time a family trip we planned together. When Daniel suggested inviting his mother along, my stomach nodded, memories of that first exclusion resurfacing like ghosts, but then I took a deep breath and said, "Yes. Let's do it." If Margaret had once excluded me, perhaps the ultimate victory was not excluding her in return, but including her on my terms. We chose a coastal town, not as glamorous as Bali but beautiful in its own right, with rocky cliffs and small sandy coves where our daughter could chase crabs and build sandcastles. Margaret arrived with her usual fuss of luggage and opinions, but to my surprise, she seemed more interested in watching her granddaughter than in controlling the rest of us. One afternoon, while Daniel took our daughter to explore tide pools, Margaret and I found ourselves alone on the porch, the sea wind tugging at our hair. She cleared her throat, her eyes on the horizon. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to think no one would ever be good enough for Daniel. Not because of who they were, but because I couldn't accept he was grown. But I see now how happy he is with you. And I see how you love your family." Her words, halting and imperfect, landed in my chest like a bomb. I smiled faintly. That's all I ever wanted, to love him, and for that to be enough. She looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time in years, her eyes weren't hard but warm, almost proud. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't before. Margaret's resistance had never truly been about me. It had been about her fear of losing him. Although that fear had caused me significant pain, I can now recognize it for what it truly was and choose to let go of its burden. That evening, at the dinner table, Daniel raised his glass and made a toast to family, his eyes meeting mine with a sense of quiet appreciation, and even Margaret joined in, smiling as our daughter giggled over her juice. It wasn't flawless, we still had our moments of tension and our differences, but it was genuine, and it was ours. Years later, as I reflect on that journey, the exclusion, the humiliation, the confrontation in Bali, and the delicate rebuilding that ensued, I see not merely a tale of conflict but a narrative of growth, of understanding that respect isn't something you demand from others but something you earn by standing firm in your identity, even when others attempt to diminish you. And I now realize, with the insight that only time can provide, that what awaited Margaret at that resort wasn't just her surprise at seeing me, but the gradual loosening of her grip, the start of her learning to share her son, her family, her life. And what awaited me was liberation, the realization that I had always belonged, even when she tried to exclude me, because belonging isn't granted by someone else's approval. It stems from the love we cultivate, the decisions we make, and the strength we embody. Life continued to unfold in both ordinary and extraordinary ways, and over time, I came to understand that the conflict with Margaret, the intense confrontation in Bali, and the years of careful negotiation had all led to something I hadn't foreseen. A deeper comprehension of myself and the type of family I wished to nurture. Daniel and I became stronger as partners, navigating parenthood with patience and humor, learning to communicate openly, and establishing boundaries that allowed Margaret to be part of our lives without dominating. Our daughter flourished, her laughter resonating throughout the house, her questions endless and sometimes tiring, but each one serving as a reminder of the joy of discovery, of innocence, and of the simple beauty of being present with someone. Margaret, too, evolved subtly over the years. She never became the mother-in-law I had always dreamed of, the one who would completely understand me, but she learned to respect me in ways that truly mattered. She sought my opinion on family issues, assisted with small tasks without any criticism, and even provided advice in a manner that felt more collaborative than authoritative. The old tensions still emerged occasionally. Sharp remarks, subtle judgments, but I had learned not to take them to heart, to respond calmly, and to allow Daniel to mediate when needed. One afternoon, while we were getting ready for our daughter's birthday party, I noticed Margaret kneeling on the floor, inflating balloons with her hands, attempting to teach our daughter how to tie ribbons. She glanced up at me and smiled, and for a brief moment, the past felt like a distant memory. I never thought I'd find joy in this, she confessed softly, her voice almost shy. I smiled back, warmth filling me. It's easier when you let go a little, I replied. She laughed, a genuine sound, and nodded. These small moments accumulated over the months and years, weaving a delicate yet strong tapestry of family life. We traveled together occasionally, always carefully choosing destinations that allowed us to enjoy our time without pressure, and I observed Margaret gradually realizing that she could appreciate her son's family without needing to control it. Our daughter, becoming more aware each day, noticed her grandmother's transformation, sometimes asking questions, sometimes sharing innocent insights that reminded us all of the simplicity of love. Then, one spring morning, a decade after the Bali confrontation, I found myself sitting on the porch with Margaret while our daughter played in the garden, sunlight filtering through the trees, the fragrance of flowers thick in the air. She looked at me with an expression that combined her old sharpness with something new, softness, humility, and even pride. "You've changed me," she said quietly, almost a whisper. My heart soared. "You didn't make it easy," I said with a smile, "but I hope I've demonstrated that we can coexist." She nodded, a slight smile playing on her lips. "More than coexist. You've shown me patience, and respect, and love." I blinked, taken aback by the sincerity in her tone. "Love," I echoed softly. "Yes. I believe I've been learning it all along, in my own way." We then sat in silence, allowing the wind and the birdsong to fill the space between us, understanding that while some wounds may never fully heal, some bridges, once constructed, can endure storms. Over the years, I maintained a journal, documenting the journey from exclusion and humiliation to understanding and resilience, and I came to realize that the narrative I had once envisioned, of revenge, of dramatic retribution, was never the tale I truly desired. What I sought was peace, authenticity, and the assurance that I could be myself and still be loved, even by those who had initially turned me away. Daniel remained my steadfast support throughout, backing me in ways that were both subtle and profound, illustrating that love could be fierce, loyal, and patient all at once, and that partnerships flourish when founded on equality rather than dominance. And Margaret, though still complex and at times challenging, had become part of a family dynamic that functioned, not perfectly, not flawlessly, but with a rhythm that allowed everyone to grow and be acknowledged. Our daughter blossomed into a bright, empathetic child, brimming with curiosity and compassion, and I observed her navigate her own little conflicts with a confidence I knew she gained from watching us, from seeing her parents assert themselves kindly yet firmly, from realizing that even difficult individuals could be understood and respected. One evening, as we all came together for a casual family dinner, I noticed Margaret watching me again. This time, her gaze was calm and reflective, not critical but thoughtful, and I recognized that she had traveled a long way from the woman who had once excluded me from a vacation so many years ago. "I must confess," she said unexpectedly, interrupting the silence, "I didn't give you enough credit." I chuckled softly, feeling warmth spread through me. "I trust you've gained some insight," I responded. She beamed, nodding her head. "More than just insight. I've gained respect. And patience. And maybe humility." A lightness filled my chest, a sense of fulfillment I had never dared to wish for. The path had been long and filled with challenges, yet it had brought me to this point, a family, imperfect yet resilient, united not by fear or control but by love and mutual understanding. In the years that followed, We celebrated milestones together, birthdays, graduations, anniversaries, each event a reminder that even the toughest relationships could change, that even those who once tried to cast us aside could, with time and effort, learn to welcome us. And through it all, I never forgot the pivotal moment, that day in Bali, when I stood my ground against exclusion, when I discovered my own strength, when I realized that standing firm against injustice was the first step in reclaiming my life. It was a lesson I took with me into every aspect of my life. The understanding that I could confront challenges with bravery, that exclusion could be turned into empowerment, and that love, when founded on respect and integrity, had the power to transform even the most unyielding hearts. As I reflect now, with Margaret softly humming while assisting our daughter with her homework, Daniel reading next to me, and the gentle glow of the evening sun illuminating the room, I understand that what awaited her at that resort was not merely the surprise of my arrival, it was the start of her own transformation. And what awaited me, all along, was a life brimming with strength, love, and the realization that I had always belonged, not because anyone granted me permission, but because I chose to assert my place, stand tall, and embrace the family we were creating together. The final years of our journey with Margaret were characterized less by dramatic confrontations and more by the quiet, subtle victories. I realized that the true victory wasn't in seeing her stumble or lose her composure, but in the tranquility that came from reclaiming my life, asserting my voice, and fostering a family environment where love, respect, and choice prevailed over fear and manipulation. Although there were still instances of tension, Margaret could be quite opinionated, insist on her own preferences, and revert to old behaviors. Those instances no longer defined us, nor did they lessen the strength I had built within myself. Daniel and I continued to evolve as partners, tackling the challenges of parenthood, work, and life together with the assurance that only comes from enduring storms and emerging stronger. Our daughter, now nearing early childhood, had absorbed lessons we hadn't directly taught her, the significance of standing up for oneself, the importance of being patient with others, and the reality that people can change, although change often requires time, effort, and empathy. Margaret's role transformed alongside our family's dynamics. She was no longer the intimidating figure of judgment but an active participant in our lives, sometimes awkward, sometimes overly eager, yet increasingly conscious of the boundaries she needed to honor and the love she could express without trying to control it. One sunny afternoon, as we relaxed in the garden, our daughter chasing butterflies and giggling, Margaret looked at me with an unusual gentleness. "You've done well," she remarked, her tone genuine, almost tentative. "I see how strong you are, and how much Daniel relies on you, not just as his wife, but as a partner, a mother, and the heart of this family." A wave of warmth washed over me, mixed with memories of the pain she had caused, and I simply smiled. "Thank you," I replied softly. "It hasn't always been easy, but it's been worth it." She nodded, and for the first time in years, I felt a change in her perspective. A recognition not only of who I was, but also that her efforts to belittle me had ultimately failed. Daniel, who had been quietly watching, took my hand and softly said, "We did it. We made it through." I returned the gesture by squeezing his hand, feeling a profound, steady love that had weathered the storms of exclusion, conflict, and misunderstandings. In the months that followed, life found a soothing rhythm. We celebrated birthdays together, enjoyed holidays filled with laughter instead of tension, shared simple dinners where Margaret occasionally offered advice but no longer enforced it, and cherished everyday moments that highlighted the fragility and beauty of family. Our daughter flourished in this nurturing environment, growing into a child who grasped the concepts of boundaries, kindness, and respect, lessons absorbed not from lectures but from watching how her parents faced challenges with courage and integrity. Then, one peaceful evening, as we observed the sun setting below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Margaret approached me quietly, holding a small gift wrapped in delicate paper. "For you," she said softly. Inside was a locket, engraved with our family's initials, a simple yet meaningful gesture. "I want you to know," she added, "that you belong. You always have, even when I couldn't see it." My throat tightened, tears brimming in my eyes, and I realized that the long journey, from exclusion in Bali to the quiet recognition of love and respect, had come full circle. I embraced her, feeling a warmth that had once seemed impossible between us, and I understood that while the past could never be erased, the present offered a fresh start. Over the years, this feeling of belonging and empowerment continued to shape our family. Daniel and I supported each other without conditions. Margaret's presence became less a source of stress and more a chance for growth, and our daughter's laughter and curiosity filled our home with joy and purpose. I discovered that the real strength in any relationship is not about control, manipulation, or exclusion, but rather about asserting oneself with integrity, standing firm in love, and handling even the toughest personalities with empathy and resilience. Sometimes, when we reflect on events that once felt like overwhelming obstacles, the Maldives trip that never materialized, the confrontation in Bali, the prolonged tension and pain, we find ourselves smiling, realizing that those experiences shaped the family we have today, imperfect yet strong, resilient, and connected by more than just blood. Watching my daughter grow, I understood that she would inherit not the fear, manipulation, or exclusion that once loomed over our family, but the strength, courage, and wisdom we had worked hard to nurture. The realization that while we may not always control others' actions, we can manage our own responses, set our own boundaries, and open our own hearts. Margaret, now older and more composed, had finally learned to coexist, to love without the need to dominate, and to accept that her son's happiness was not a threat to her own, but rather a part of a broader, richer tapestry of life and family. As for me, I had found my own strength, my own voice, and the understanding that belonging is not something given by someone else's choice. It is something we claim, nurture, and live out every single day. The memory of that initial moment, when she had left me out of a vacation and I felt small and powerless, had evolved into a symbol of resilience and victory. What awaited her at the resort years ago was my presence, yes, but more importantly, it was a lesson she could not overlook, that respect, love, and integrity are undeniable, that attempts to control another's life are always limited, and that true strength is quiet, steady, and unwavering. What awaited me was everything I had fought for, a life brimming with love, family, laughter, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that I had not only endured exclusion and judgment but had come out stronger, wiser, and truly seen. As I tucked our daughter into bed that night, sharing tales of adventures, bravery, and kindness, I felt the warmth of a long, challenging journey settle in my heart. Margaret stood in the doorway, smiling gently, and I realized that the story we once feared might shatter us had instead laid a foundation, one that would last for generations, teaching that even the toughest relationships can grow, that love can triumph over fear, and that belonging is something we create and treasure every single day.